So I've got a lot of material in here, and I don't intend on necessarily finishing it all. So do slow it down as much as needed. It's kind of interesting to talk. Yeah. Okay. So I'm assuming everyone online can hear me, and I guess I'll start talking, but they can speak up if not. They're going to talk about acoustic monitoring of biodiversity, which is the kind of area that our lab is engaged in. I'm in life sciences. I'm the only IX life sciences representative, at least as a faculty, but maybe that'll change soon. So why do we care about biodiversity? It's pretty central to a bunch of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Food security, human welfare, sustainable economy, like you name it, there's some link to biodiversity. So preserving and managing biodiversity is pretty important. If we're going to do preservation of biodiversity and conserving of ecosystem functions and all the things that humans rely on biodiversity for, we need data-driven decision making. So this is either at the policy level in terms of like Westminster, but also at the local, a farmer has a small patch of forest at the edge of their land. How do they manage it? How do they make sure it maintains populations of species that are important to their day-to-day activities? Collecting biodiversity data, acoustics is very good. There's a bunch of animals across species classes who make sounds, and they make sounds not just telling you whether they're there or not, but also what they're doing, their behavior, their welfare, their activities, all sorts of things. So it's a very information dense signal for one signal and one way to monitor biodiversity. Obviously, it's not going to catch everything, but it's pretty good. Some random quick bits of terminology from the outset. Bioacoustics, you'll have probably heard, if you've ever heard of this kind of field, bioacoustics is like the most popular term used, and it's typically study of animal sounds. Recently, I guess what we're engaged in our lab is more eco-acoustics, which is the study of ecosystem soundscape. Bioacoustics is more to do with behavioral things. So there's people who will do the bioacoustics of the larynx of a moose, for example, and that counts as a bioacoustic study. But that very much wouldn't count as an eco-acoustic study where you're looking at ecosystem scale processes and soundscapes as a whole. And the soundscape is just the total acoustic environment of the place. You can have urban soundscapes, you can have natural soundscapes. But I'm inevitably going to just use words without defining them throughout the talk. And so please put your hand up and be like, boy, what's that? The standard workflow for acoustic monitoring of biodiversity looks something like this. So you start with some sensor technology, some devices. With that in mind and the limitations of that, you set up your survey design, stratify across some gradient that you're interested in, biodiversity, how does it vary or how does it, what's the state of biodiversity at this particular place or at this particular time. You collect your audio and your metadata, you do some processing, maybe some denoising. I don't know, this is taken from a review paper, signal classification and detection, I'd actually put it there. But you can turn it into species detection records, these species are here. You can either look at soundscape metrics overall, and then you finally do some statistical analysis to turn it into sort of ecological trends or like spatial distributions of animals, for example, or migration timing of something like that. The components we're going to focus on today have to do with sensor technology and then the species detection, how we create species detection records from the audio and soundscape metrics, and then a little nod to some survey design stuff in terms of multi-sensor networks, but actually we won't go into too much detail on that. So the first question is, how do we record audio data scalably over long durations? The classic way this is done in, and saying classic's a bit much in a field that's not that old, but the classic way to do it is to use these offline sensors. So it's a sensor, it's got a microphone, it's got an SD card and some batteries, and you stick it out in the forest, and it costs surprisingly a lot for some models, but you go back a week later and you pick it up, you change the batteries, change your SD cards. There's cheaper versions now which are open source. The AudioMoss is a good example, but it's still the same idea. Replaceable batteries, replaceable SD cards, you collect your data. More recently, connected sensors have become a thing. So the Rainforest Connection, what they did, at least when they started out, was they repurposed old mobile phones, and they were like, there's this whole problem of e-waste, and most of them have a working CPU and everything. So what if we could load some custom software on the mobile phone, have it powered by solar panels?
Hear about the microphones, kind of like antenna pattern. That's where it's like directionally sensitive to, or it's just like you want to collect all specific isotopes.
So right now we're talking about omnidirectional microphones. So you're collecting isotropically kind of within the constraints of your device, so kind of 180-ish. But I'll talk about spatial sensors in a second. Yeah, so all of this are omnidirectional, one single microphone, mono channel. This is a device that we developed, so it was called Bug, and it's a Raspberry Pi compute module and a few custom PCBs, and then some injection molded enclosures, and it uploads data via the mobile internet, and it's powered by solar panels typically. And then here's a cool project that was done in the Olympic Park in London, East London, by UCL, was like the Echo box. And here, what it's attached to, you can't see, is a lamppost. So there's wide power and internet to all of these lampposts, so they could just hook onto existing infrastructure and then deploy sensors which detect bats and do the edge detection on the device and then send it back up. I can't remember whether it sent it actually through some wired network or through LoRa, but it was doing some edge detection on the device. So these are like typical kind of like the new side of connected sensors rather than the old. But I would still say approximately like 90.
Do you mean by edge detection, like edge AI or like edge?
Yeah. Yeah, edge AI. I think it's using a neural network.
It's like on the device.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I'd say still about 90+% of eco-acoustic studies use these offline sensors. So this is very much like the new and upcoming, but it's not that widely adopted. So just to look inside a device, if anyone's interested in how we did the Bug device, it's, in blue is like the microphone and the front panel, Raspberry Pi compute modules, some PCBs, and you can design your sensor as you wish, but this is how we did ours, and all of our designs are open source if people want to buy them. Addressing the question about spatial localization. So there are two ways to, if you've got a single device, you've got that uncertainty of where's that animal, right? It could be, really, it can be anywhere within your sensor detection area. You might say it's quieter if it's further away, but actually the way that sound propagates through forest environments or through complex like ecosystem environments is like very unreliable due to just an animal behind you versus an animal in front of you at the same distance are going to sound very different. So you can actually have multiple devices where you have time synchronized devices collecting data, and then you can look at the time difference of arrival and you can figure out exactly what animals. But you can imagine this needs extremely dense sensor networks, right? At least 3 recorders need to pick up the same sound at a given time. Another approach, which was by Becky Heath, who's at Imperial actually, or was at Imperial when she did this, is a single device, but with a 6-channel, sorry about the resolution of this, 6-channel microphone array on a single device. So this is a real-time connected device, and by looking at the time difference arrival, you can get the direction of arrival of the audio signal. This is like quite important because, as I said, when you've got one microphone, if you hear 10 vocalizations, it could be 10 individuals vocalizing once, or it could be one individual vocalizing 10 times. But if you hear 10 vocalizations and 5 are from that side and 5 from that side, there's at least 2 groups right there. And whether each group has more or not is a separate question, but you get a bit more bit more information about population size and such. Okay, so we got these devices. At what scales are like networks of these devices typically deployed? And I'll kind of just skip to the cutting edge, right? Because it should be said that deploying 10 offline devices is done hundreds of times around the world, and it's useful for collecting a snapshot of biodiversity. But we're talking about like networks, like large-scale, long-term networks. So these are a couple of networks that we've deployed in our work, and these are both using Bug systems or predecessors of. So it's real-time uploading audio. The first is in the SAFE project in Borneo. So here we had an oil palm landscape with fragments of tropical forest within it. I'm trying to understand how biodiversity changes with fragment size or distance from forest edge and these kind of parameters to kind of inform how would you do sustainable agriculture, right? If you have to turn this into agriculture, can you leave patches of forest that maintain a meaningful amount of biodiversity? And then on the right-hand side was a national network in Norway. So here's from the southern tip of Norway right to deep inside the Arctic and the whole latitudinal range. And we were trying to look at how bird migration timing, like how can we measure that exactly? The current state of the art for getting bird data or migration timing data is 2 samples around spring when a bunch of people think this is about right. I think I've seen a few birds around. Let's coordinate a whole sampling around this. And it's a big citizen science effort. So, and they collect data that we can't through acoustics, such as number of breeding pairs and nests and whatever. But the idea of it here was if we overlap with their sites and do a massive subset of sites, can we determine the optimal timing to go and launch these large scale citizen science efforts to collect the detailed data? On a larger scale, even more, there's across Australia, they've got 300 odd sites in the Australian Acoustic Observatory. These are actually using offline sensors, so you can imagine the logistical craziness of collecting data from 300 sites. And actually, I think they do it through like partnerships with schools and everything to go and visit the site and pick up some data and this kind of thing. But the scale is pretty unprecedented, and it's like just as the data management at that scale is a whole thing. And then here is a project we just kicked off like maybe a month ago in Europe, which is TABMON, so Transnational Acoustic Biodiversity Monitoring, something like that. And the idea here is to take the Norway project and extend it. So you can imagine the Norway project was through Norway, and now we're going to set up some sensing devices in the Netherlands, France, and Spain. And it's a major flyway. So can we actually pick up migration on a way huger latitudinal scale and pick up these trends of how animals are moving around? So, okay, now we've got all of this data. How can we gain biodiversity insight from it? And this is where, you know, the AI comes in. Typically, when you're dealing with audio data, you start in the time domain, you've got a waveform, and you turn it into a spectrogram, so time frequency representation. Time on the x-axis, frequency on the y. So you can see these little chirps, and then a trill, and you can't really see it from the waveform, but you can there. And then, whoa, it's just image-based object section, trying to determine which animals are which and where they are, this kind of thing. Yeah, so there's a few frameworks that you can work in that are not quite full-based image object section, right? You can just say in this file, is this species present or not? Binary, you can do multi-species classification. So, you know, here you can say from this time period to this time period, this species was here. So this is all looking at the same spectrum to start and time to so frequently bounding boxes. Typically, I'd say the middle one is most common. But yeah. So what data do we have to play with if we're trying to do this task of species vocalization detection? There's some really large citizen science data sets. So this one's called Xeno-Canto. Hundreds of thousands, I think 700,000+ audio clips of a bird, which have been uploaded by anyone who's in nature, has a microphone, records it and says, oh, this is a kiwi, I'm going to upload it. And then, you know, you can imagine you pick up a very diverse data set that way. And another is the Macaulay Library, which is hosted by Cornell, and a similar idea, but just a different library. What's interesting to note is in nature, there's about 2 million animal species. This number's debated, but it can go, you know, 1 to 3 kind of thing. There's 11,000 birds, 0.55%. The breakdown of Xeno-Canto in terms of clips is about 800,000 bird samples and about 23,000 grasshoppers and bats, and nothing of the rest. So birds are historically enormously overstudied proportionally to like the amount of biodiversity they make up. And this is true actually across ecology, but acoustics, it really bears out in terms of these data sets and stuff. So as I've put at the start, right, there's mammals that make it sounds. Most soundscapes are actually pretty insect driven when you go to warmer climates, especially. But we just don't have data for a lot of species, but we have a lot for birds because there's a massive hobbyist community around the world and has been for decades uploading these data sets. So with these bird data sets, bird vocalization data sets, there's been a few global bird ID models. So BirdNet's from the Cornell lab, and this is a CNN-based model. The details can't remember exactly right now, but it's open source, which is quite nice. They've got all their models on GitHub, and you can just go use it. You can download a bit of audio, you can run BirdNet, and you can tell. And it has 6,000+ species, like truly global in some sense. Merlin is another thing that comes from the same building in Cornell, which is an interesting, because it's not the same building in the same way that, you know, I could be working on a thing here and there's someone else working on the thing down the hall in IX. These are huge projects with tens of employees each on them. So, but Merlin is very public facing. It's all about this like app that they've made and sort of community engagement with biodiversity and stuff. But they don't have an open source model, but they're both, it's a kind of interesting, weird dynamic. And you could see actually earlier, the second biggest data set, or actually maybe even bigger than Xenocanto, was Cornell's own. And access to it all to train your models isn't available to anyone. Like you can go and access specific parts, but so it's no coincidence that the best global biodiversity models are coming from the Cornell lab. Google have also recently thrown their hat in the ring, and I couldn't find they don't have much in the way of branding for their project, so I found Google Birds. But they created a model called Perch, which from whatever small publications they've got out, it looks like it works okay. But it's nowhere near well as well documented stuff, but it's on the horizon. So I guess, okay, these models exist, but how well do they actually work in real world data? So this is a paper that we recently put out, and it's in revision. It's we asked this question: how well do these global bird ID models work? So the first thing is you collect acoustic data from your ecosystem. So we've got 4 different ecosystems where we had, you know, 50,000, 80,000, 25,000 hours of data. We ran BirdNet is the one we ran with on this one to detect vocalizations of as many species as BirdNet could do. We got an expert who knew all of the bird calls at each of these locations to validate our data, and then we looked at how we could pull out biodiversity trends and if it was actually useful. So when we got the expert to validate the data, we got them to listen to 50 detections per species in each data set. And so what you see here is the precision at a given data set optimized threshold for each species. So what you can see in Norway, there's like 30 odd species for which there's every single sample they listened to was correct. So it's actually quite good. Already you're seeing, and in Taiwan, you know, about half of the 30 species for 100% precision. You see here, Costa Rica and Brazil have far fewer species. For those without any biological background, there are more bird species in Costa Rica and Brazil than there are in Norway. And maybe Taiwan's debatable, but certainly the Norway. So this is pointing at another massive bias of those training data sets, which is towards North American and European species, just because of the history of ecology and whatever, you know, confusing history that means. So one thing is positive from this is, okay, wow, we can take a model off the shelf, chuck it anywhere. And actually, if you do this relatively fast validation step, you know, about 30 minutes per species at maximum, can just listening to little clips, you can suddenly, from those hundreds of thousands of hours of data, know every single place. But what's kind of interesting to note is if we look at these 3 species, the barn swallow, the common sandpiper, and the Eurasian woodcock, they work really well in Norway, but they work really badly in Taiwan. The precision is data set specific. So precision is species specific is the first message, but precision is also data set specific. And this is to do with all of the background sounds that might be different in a different deployment, right? You've got 1 different sensors, 2 different confusion sounds. That might be a road nearby, and one, or there might be other species which are confusing to the algorithm. So you can't really just take them off the shelf and, you know, just be like, oh, I saw someone in Norway found the barn swallow worked. Well, chuck it here. It's a bit more laborious than that.
Just for understanding, the truth here is what the expert.
Yeah. So each of these bars, it doesn't quite work because we also use the 50 to optimize the threshold. But each of these bars says, like, if I listen to 50 detections, how many of them are correct? Okay. Positives versus true, false positives.
And we can trust the expert.
Yes, yeah. I think that's like, I mean, there's there's discussions of mimicry and stuff, right? Animals mimicking others, but
Yeah,
for this purpose, that's quite low, like a low percentage.
Let's check. So is it the same model tested on?
Yeah, like the same model, asterisk, because these are massive data sets and we'd kind of run one a while before. So it's the same like architecture and the same training data sets, but maybe like they tweaked it for
Is it like that the assumes the model has been trained with like sort of clean data, not that it's mixed of some like environment sounds?
So the model does have mixed, like those public data sets have sounds with a bunch of background, and actually in training BirdNet, I think they did a bunch of data augmentation and stuff. So it's marketed as a, you should be able to put anything in and get the right. They make apps, right? So you go out and you do it, and you've got a phone microphone. You haven't got like a shop microphone. But it's just, I think that soundscapes are so complex and there's so many different components that truly making something work noise free is.
Yeah, because it's a different than images, because images don't have superposits.
Yeah.
And each soundscape will just have one. Yeah, this is like one classified lane, or you could have multiple.
Yeah, so it's at the 3-second resolution.
Okay,
So,
3 seconds.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And each 3-second can have multiple species.
Okay.
But yeah, sorry, just to follow up. So I guess, so for example, the species you highlighted at the top in Norway.
Yeah.
Like, but I guess does the difference between Norway and Taiwan with that species suggest that, you know, like you said, it's not just picking up on the bird call, but it's also using information from the background. So like maybe in Norway, if it's learned like this bird tends to be associated with this soundscape.
Yeah.
And so I can use that to classify it.
Yeah.
It's like in a different environment. But it's
Very, very good comment. Hold the thought. You'll see it in a minute. Why I say that. I think for this example, like probably less so, but that whole thought process has a logical direction that I'll come to in a bit.
Yeah, perhaps you will have like, have you tried to do this with some like decomposition that like kind of like network decomposes, it tries to pick the most like leading sound and then like.
As in blind source separation.
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
like, yeah. So that's certainly an area that people.
Blind or something like that.
Yeah. I haven't done it myself, but I've seen people do like, you know, Google's Mix-It model, and they've like transfer learned across for bioacoustics, and yeah.
That could be perhaps interesting with this context.
I in fact have an undergraduate project trying to do it, but I think I asked way too much, so maybe they'll have to reel it in a bit. Maybe it just ends up as frequency filtering. So this is then, okay, so once we have that data, we can say our acceptable level of noise in our data is nothing. I need to know that it's as close to 100% precision, right? And that's what we said in this case. And then we can look at each of these data sets and we can say, for the species we believe, look at all these different things that we can look. So in Brazil, we looked at diurnal patterns. Some species vocalize only at dawn, others only at dusk, others evenly through the day. So that's what that top left panel is showing. This is species richness in some kind of normalized way for Costa Rica. And you're seeing more species richness in grassland than you are in secondary or old growth or whatever. But actually, when you talk to someone who knows these species, they'll say, all of these species are very generalist. And that makes sense, right? You'd have more data from the species which are in more urban environments, which are being collected by citizen science data. So like, this is like a kind of a slightly warning side. It's like, yes, you can look at species richness across habitat types, but you kind of need to keep in account the biases of your species at work. This one's looking at the willow warbler across a latitudinal gradient. So Kristiansand is literally the most southern point in Norway, and Tromsø is like deep in the Arctic. And you see as the time goes on through the spring season, from April to end of June, that it migrates northwards, and you can pick out arrival dates at different times. And this bottom one's super cool. It's the species community in Taiwan from January 2019 to December 2020, so 2 full year periods. And Taiwan's really interesting because you get both wintering, like in the UK, we get birds which come here to breed, but no birds would come in their winters. You know, the same birds that breed here go to the tropics to winter. In Taiwan, it's at that kind of crossover period. So you get some species which are coming there to breed and others which are coming there to winter. And so you kind of see quite complex migratory dynamics. Whereas if you looked at this same plot for Norway, it would just be like lots in spring and summer and nothing for winter. Yeah, so just saying that you can pick up spatial, temporal trends across small scale, you know, on the literal hour of the day or on the year scale, and spatial trends on the whole country or on the kind of landscape in Costa Rica. Okay, what about the 99.45% of all the other animals? Data deficiency. There's just not enough training data for these animals, and that's fundamentally the limitation. The situation is improving. There's like slow, you know, people are setting up, here's a data set, put insect sound. But like, whilst the will is there, really the real legwork in collecting the data is the limitation.
So you don't necessarily need to do it in a supervised manner? Are there big projects that are just trying to discover species in an unsupervised fashion?
Not as many as you might imagine. I think it's because the data is ultimately used by ecologists at the end, who all their frameworks fall into, you know, like all of the policy is defined like as you're protecting this set of species in these set of areas or these set of like.
But I mean, you know, once you've got like consistent classes that you've inferred,
Okay, yeah,
then you could like subsequently what they're label them if you wanted.
So this is the other project that my other undergraduate student is doing, who's actually getting closer to. So yeah, it's like unsupervised detection of species classes. There's not big projects doing it, but I think it's a cool idea and a cool way to go.
Because you like back to the say established species.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. So it's like I think that area of research, I think the most exciting part crosses over with human computer interaction. So it's like I've got an expert who knows a bunch of stuff, and they give me 1,000 hours, or there's 1,000 hours of data on their computer, and they got a nice UI that in the background has done a really good embedding of all those 1,000 hours of data, and they're like, here's 1 or 2 sounds that I kind of want to look for. And it like searches, it's like yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, right? Like based on your embedding space. And then you can like fine tune your embedding space, do that.
So it's basically like manually labeling the embedding space.
Exactly,
You
yeah.
have to something what people say it's correct.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Because I don't think you could do it without that final step, right? Because people need to know which animals, right? But also that mapping of like, one species can actually sing, it can call, it can alarm, right? So there's like 5 different clusters which are very disparate.
It's sort of like the alignment step in LLM. You need to have human there to align here. It's like species labels.
Yeah. But I mean, with smallish data sets and per local kind of problem, you can do transfer learning with CNN. So here's like a review paper from not too long ago, which looked at off-the-shelf CNN architectures used in like vocalization detection literature. And these are all quite popular names, and it's just like this is just CNNs because it is mainly CNNs. There's a few which use RNNs or other things, but CNNs work well for image, and this is an image problem really.
But it is an image with a known like repeating structure, like some oscillatory pattern. So
Yeah.
I can imagine maybe like there might be a way of using that in the architecture of the network.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think that's where like a lot of the people, I would be considered a technical ML person in the eco-acoustics world, and I don't consider myself that in the like machine learning world, right? So I think that there's enormous scope for people with more confidence in manipulating CNN architectures and stuff to come in and create better models for sure. Yeah. But I would say a lot of these, the transfer learned from image models with very little data, and they work quite well. So like you can get quite a long way. It seems to be like obviously there is a weirdness in that like fundamentally spectrograms are not invariant in the y-axis, right? But they are kind of invariant in the x-axis. But CNNs assume invariance in both. But I think the benefits that you get, what we're seeing basically is the benefits that you get from large trained like feature extracting networks outweigh the benefits you might get from a more custom thing with a smaller amount of data. Oh, like I've done projects which are like hundreds of samples, like if that, like of 3-second samples, not not thousands or 10,000s. Yeah. But there is like
the representations are pretty much universal. It's 2 dimensions of these super big image models.
Yeah.
So you should be able to use them pretty well.
Yeah. Few-shot learning is another, way to approach this data deficiency issue. So this is a D-Case, which is like a conference on detection and classification of acoustic sound events challenge, which they gave, training and test data set. But what was quite nice is they said, after this time period, we'll give you 5 positive examples, and then you're going to be evaluated on the same file, but into the future. So it's like it's independent, so train and test. And people can do quite well, right? Like the baseline scores for this were like 20% S score or something, but like you're getting models which are working up to 60%. But obviously that's quite a lot of headroom. But I would say it's an incredibly difficult problem if you think about it, right? Like they're looking at, I think hyenas were one and other bird species. Obviously, because even when you're doing this, people still resort to bird species, which is a bit of a shame. But yeah, all sorts of few shot learning techniques, which to be honest, I'm not very well versed in, but it is an area of active research that people are looking at. So again, if this is an area you know a lot about, then this could be quite an obvious place to contribute. So can we skip vocalization detection altogether and predict biodiversity from the acoustic features? So this is kind of what you were getting at. So as we talked about, right, you can have file 1, file 2. I found these vocalizations, yes, no, and that's how I get to my biodiversity data set, which is a taxonomy by space or time, kind of like overall thing that you're looking for. And you get very relevant outputs. This is exactly what ecologists know how to work with and have done forever, but it's difficult to build the models. Acoustic features are a different way. So you can look at the minute of audio and you can say what's the volume of this and the volume of that, and does volume somehow correlate with species richness, for example, or functional diversity of the species communities, or maybe you can jump right to the end and it's like, does acoustic features vary with pollination probability on a given flower, right? Like, so what your final answer is, and it's like end-to-end learning. So there's this huge area of like soundscape indices where people have defined, you know, activity at different things, but there's acoustic complexity index, acoustic diversity index, where people look at entropies and different frequency bands. But these are all just handcrafted indices, and they're done univariate. Like this feature correlates with biodiversity in my data set. Cool. I can go and put a sensor somewhere else, and I don't need to create a new model. But as you guys all know, like you can get CNN embeddings to kind of do this in a better way, right? So you learn the features from the data. And what we found is that the CNN embeddings with Nick, when I did my PhD, capture expected community patterns quite well. So in this top left plot, for example, we're looking at 6 different data sets. That's 7 different data sets. And we see that certain areas of the feature space correspond to temperate regions. So the pink and the brown are like Ithaca and New Zealand is that one. So it's like a temperate region, and there's like a tropical region where you get data from Malaysia and Sulawesi and Indonesia. And so there's some expected, these are just 2D projections colored post hoc of VGG-ish embeddings, so CNN embeddings. And then you can also see that landscape wise, you get the same thing. So this different forest quality is defined by above ground biomass in the SAFE project, actually. These are nice, nice cyclical. This is 3 years of data from the US. So winter months here, summer months there, and it repeats cyclically, and diurnal patterns as well, right? Where there's a dawn chorus at 6 a.m. There's a big jump over to the diurnal features and then a big jump back to the nocturnal features. So like all this is saying is this captures expected community patterns, just like eyeballing it. You're like, okay, this kind of looks like it could be picking up on what we kind of wanted to pick up on. And it should be said that in this paper, we looked at the classification, performance using these acoustic features. So doing an end-to-end on each of these tasks, right, to predict time, to predict habitat quality. And it worked quite well and outperformed the indices, which is kind of a thing you see across the machine learning literature, right? And this is even more to what your point said. Given a location soundscape, can you predict species presence without it vocalizing? So we looked at this, and the way we did it is we had a data set of, I think, a lot, like 1,000 20-minute point count. So a point count is a person in the environment writing down every species they see, and they're doing a full community. So you have presence and absence for each species for a given 20 minutes. They weren't aligning exactly the times, or the data wasn't collected very well, such that you couldn't tell this vocalization. And also this vocalization was at this time, and also they were looking at purely visual observations where the animal wasn't vocalizing. But what we did is we took all the soundscape features where the species was present, so all the 20-minute clips, chucked them all together where the species was present during that 20 minutes, and then the same for the absent, and then looked at the log likelihood difference between these two PDFs. So you get, for each 20-minute clip, then you get a probability that that species is there, and it's not based on any vocalization detection. It's just based on using audio as a habitat suitability indicator. And so then when we do this on our test data, we see some of the sites here on this axis. So oil palms, selected or salvage log forest and old growth. So like the habitat policy goes down this axis. And then hour of day, logs 24 along the x-axis. And in blue is the predicted occurrence from this soundscape model. And in red is the true occurrence. And there's repeats, which is why it's continuous from the human observer. And so you see that for species which are mainly found in the lower quality forest, but throughout the day, species which are dawn throughout all of the areas, or species which are nocturnal, heavily a little bit biased towards the higher quality forest, we can kind of pick up on these occurrence patterns just from the soundscapes. And we actually did go and look back at the audio files and look at how our classification scores were varying. And like for examples where, you know, there was a 20-minute clip, but there was actually the species vocalizing in that clip, our classification probabilities didn't change near the vocalization. So we really are just picking up on the general soundscape rather than learning the vocalization. Although with a larger and more controlled data set, I believe you could use this model to then discover vocalizations, but it would be a very niche case where you wanted to do this. And another thing is that, you know, for habitat suitability, you can use satellite data with LiDAR or hyperspectral imagery. And we looked at using airborne LiDAR data, so very high resolution data about the structure of the forest, and predictions of occurrence were less accurate using that than using audio. So there is some advantage of being on the ground and getting like some data from underneath the forest canopy. That improves your predictions. So a little bonus from this that we kind of wasn't the main focus was that if you put all your data into this probability density function, you can learn what a normal sound model is, and in an unsupervised way, you can pick out the anomalies. So we did this and we tested whether the anomalies correlated with sounds that we thought would be important. So chainsaws, right? If you know you've got illegal logging going on, do you either train the chainsaw detector and then have to retrain a new one every time the loggers get a new chainsaw? Or do you just know that gunshots and chainsaws and stuff are quite improbable sounds? And maybe that's a way of alerting some patrol of rangers coming in the area. We did playback experiments at different distances, and so the anomaly scores rised at the right time, and that it worked for, you know, sounds like chainsaws and gunshots and chopping. So there's never been any learning of what these sounds are. It's just unsupervised. It's not what we normally see in this area or hear in this area. Okay, and then
actually the underlying ML model.
Also, sorry,
you learn like PDFs. So like you explicitly constructed like PDFs or something like this.
sorry. So the PDF here is just learned from, you just collect 5 days of audio from a spot, and you just fit the PDF to that 5 days of audio. So it's like,
yeah, I'm asking what is the model you pick, like the PDF estimate?
oh, GMM.
Yeah.
Yeah, Gaussian mixed
Gaussian
models,
mixed.
yeah. Yeah.
In how many dimensions?
128. So this is just a visualization of
It's the embedding.
Yeah, the embedding dimension. Yeah. Okay, so similar to the earlier question we asked about species vocalization detection models, are soundscape predictions of biodiversity accurate and reliable? So here we collected, again, point counts, someone standing there listening, and then audio collected at the same time. And we wanted to understand whether the soundscape predictions of, actually in this case, we focused on species richness, because that tends to be what people look at most. They want to say in the soundscape, how many species or what's the species community. So we had to have on the ground data with corresponding audio data to know how well we could predict this. And we got it from around the world from different data sets to really, you know, spread our test. What we see here is univariate correlations between certain features and species richness in each of these data sets. So in blue are the learned features, those 128 BGDH embeddings, and in orange are 60 soundscape indices that typically used. So this might seem like a weird thing to do, but most people are looking for one magic soundscape indice that measures their thing. And I think what we're trying to say here is that you might get correlations that work in 2 of your data sets, one of your data sets, but the odds of that same soundscape index correlating with biodiversity in all your data sets is like low, and this is only 4, right? So you can imagine it's this, if we tested 10, it would get down to 0 quite quickly. And actually, to be honest, for the features that were even in that 4 column, the uncertainty, we're just looking at, is there a significant correlation? The actual ability to predict, given a soundscape feature, the species richness, the uncertainty bars are so wide as to be pretty much meaningless as a predictive sense. Then you might say, well, why don't you use something multivariate like a machine learning model on the embeddings? And same thing bears out, right? In Malaysia, if you trained a model to predict species richness from a soundscape, you can get quite good R-squared. But if you then take that model, put it anywhere else, it doesn't work. And if we did one for it all put together, you know, it was just predicting on the largest data sets. So I guess the kind of message here is that soundscapes, like species richness, sounds different in different places. And like, it's like both obvious and not obvious, because people are always like, surely there's something, right? There's something about like difference of features or difference of frequencies or entropy or whatever that increases. But fundamentally, I think the mapping from species community to soundscape is so heavily biased by one or two species in a certain place, and then heavily biased by another different subset of community in a different place. So yeah, and yeah, caveat is this is for avian species, because that's what we have the data for. But I think the kind of message would follow through if you had full species community data. That's something I'd like to look at. So there is one thing that was consistent across all of the data sets, was that soundscape change correlated with community change. So this is pairwise distances. So from file 1 to file 2, how different was the soundscape on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, how different were the species communities with like a Jacquard distance. And there are consistent relationships. So you could then, you know, think of, I'm going to set out a massive network of monitoring devices, and as long as each year my profile looks like this in each of my places, it's all fine. But then one year, if it looks a bit different, I can send someone to go and survey on the ground and see what's changed, see whether it's meaningful. So maybe you could use that, but it's not a golden bullet, as you can see, right? Again, the uncertainties are enormous. Like, and there's particularly an enormous amount of times where the soundscape distance is almost 0, and the community distance is enormous, like almost completely community turnover, 2 completely distinct.
So what's the meaning of 2 dots on one of your figures with different species community distances? Is that a different location, or
just a different audio file? So like, is that the audio file basis, or like, what was it? Yeah, at the sample of the point count audio file basis are all like 1-to-1. So it could be at the same location at a different time, but it also could be at a different location at a different time at the same time. But yeah, it's like, I think this, again, heavily caveated by we're only looking at species community distances for the avian communities. So if you included insects and stuff, and if you manage to then weight the species by how vocal you know them to be, but that's going to be different in each data set. Maybe you could get a cleaner correlation here, but yeah, something to be explored. Okay, and then finally, just a random look at some ongoing future research a bit. Something I'm quite interested in is how low cost can we make sensors? Can we make entire sensing devices for, you know, £1 to £5 maybe? When you think of a battery and a watch, you don't think about replacing it. It's lost for a year or two. You know, can we get the same, and can we get edge detection working on devices of this sort of power budget and cost budget? Collaborating with a team at AIMS, African Institute of Mathematical Sciences, who actually you guys are the fellows will know, in South Africa, who does a lot on model compression and data compression for audio and bioacoustics specifically. And this is just a kind of weird, wacky project that I've loved, where this person got a plant to take a selfie of itself using its own power. So it's microbial fuel cells from the root of the plant powering a capacitor, which then discharges through a very low power camera platform and takes a picture. So like
load it to Instagram.
with a tree, yeah. But yeah, it's like some nice ways, you know, energy harvesting, all of these kind of things to really, really like lower your power budget, and maybe we can do away with batteries entirely. Biodegradable sensors exist, so these are electronic circuits. I think I might have presented this before, and has anyone seen it? No? Okay. Biodegradable sensors exist. So that's an entirely functioning electronic circuit with a resistor, capacitor, and inductor. But within 20 minutes or 10 minutes, it biodegrades into completely harm-free products. And these have been really pioneered in the medical sciences. So implanted arterial blood pressure monitors, which then you don't need to do a second surgery to take out, but you can get very accurate measurements. So bioresorbable in that case, which is a subset of biodegradable. So then we're kind of exploring, can we use this kind of technology in ecological monitoring? So we fly a drone over an area that we can't access by foot. We drop sensors from which we can collect data wirelessly. And then afterwards, we don't need to go and retrieve the sensors. So like sensor deployment robotically is relatively easy. Sensor retrieval robotically is almost impossible in like any real complex environment. You can imagine, right, a leaf falls on it, and then your robot has to have manipulation to do. So if we can use biodegradable sensors, we don't have to do this kind of sensor retrieval. We can just fly things over, drop the data. We can have the drone maybe perched nearby, collect the data, and go off. So Millie is working on the drone aspect of this project, including like onboard sensors. So the first stage it might be the drone autonomously navigates around an area, perches, has an onboard sensor, moves somewhere else. It's a dynamic autonomous sampling strategy. And then a PhD student in TU Delft with a material science collaborator is working on a microphone that is biodegradable and works from a distance, wireless data. So the battery it's based on a spy device. It doesn't have a battery. It's just a resonant cavity with an antenna, and it works through backscatter. So you ping it with your signal, and you receive a like modulated signal back from it.
That's very well.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Is it sampling? So does it only give you an acoustic sample at the time that you ping it, or does it have some capacitance such that it can record at some other time and then give you data from some other time?
No, so it's like at least the design we're going with is because the difficulty with the biodegradable sensors is there's no digital fabrication with biodegradable sensing technologies. That's like quite a long way off. So we're entirely in the analog realm. So it's just whilst you're hitting it with a signal, you're getting back an analog.
What about the sound of the drone?
Well, the drone's perched, right? So that's, the drone's landed or perched in a tree, which Millie has built perfectly and works. Yeah, this is the vision, right? And we've submitted a massive grant that's going to get rejected to do the vision, but we'll continue. This is less of a future thing, but it's actually some papers that have been done, but they're quite cool. You're collecting a huge amount of audio data, and a lot of the time you're storing the raw audio. There's some privacy implications. Even though we put the sensing devices away from trails and away from built environments, people still go for walks and walk their dog and all. So we looked at voice activity detection for anonymization, but also we saw that we can measure peaks in human activity and how that might be interesting to look at peaks in bird activity, for example, or insect activity, and whether there's interactions between humans and animals on very, very fine scale temporal resolutions in a way that we can't with other data sources. And then, in Norway, for example, we looked at, this is a team in Norway, Ben Cresswell led it, but data set from Yellowstone National Park in the US, where they looked at how snowmobiles passing and their noise affected bird vocalization patterns. And we saw there was like a decrease and then an increase and the length of increase depended on the kind of site we were at, but it's just this interaction. And it wasn't just a decrease through confusion, right? We were looking at scales that like minutes away from the snowmobile. And then interpretable soundscape models. So, we looked at a lot of GMMs and PDFs built on soundscapes, but what if we could start to give meaning to these? So this is Arpit Om Prakash, who's a PhD student in India, who's looking at, he's got 3 land use types: reference, agriculture, and disturbed, from a bunch of different habitats in like India, from Bangalore up to the Western Ghats, so tropical forest, deciduous, scrubland. And he's looking at if we know the land use type and we can put these PDFs, we can find areas of the acoustic feature space that only are found in agricultural or only found in habitat, or what's the thing that tells us that this is what's that grey circle that is agriculture. It's like some sound that we don't hear in the other place. That's quite obvious. Maybe it's just machinery, but there's subtler between the disturbed and reference for sure. And it's kind of, can you get at a concept of like, well, first, honest models, all of those blue areas are soundscape feature space, like areas that were common between all 3 of them. So rather than picking a random one to classify it as, you can just say, I'm not sure. You can explore data, you can look at efficient summaries, you can, say what are the unique things to low quality or high quality habitat. And I think this is a really cool one. Keystone sounds. Can we start to pick out what sounds are the like ones that are threatened by certain types of land use change? It's a thought of like keystone species is quite well established, but maybe we also care about keystone sounds. And so with that, thank you. I'm just about stealing time. Thank you to you, collaborators and funders. Oh,
Question, but does it exist this kind of like Google Street View, but for audio? So I could just like take it off, like take a location, then I could hear the soundscape.
oh, I mean, you know, we talked about Australia being one of the largest networks, and that's 300 across the country of Australia. So, like
Because
nowhere near Street View.
Because technically, I mean, it's the mobile phone users would give permission, then like
Oh yeah,
Google and
yeah.
Apple and
I've looked into. I've sent. This is more during my PhD when I was less cynical about the world. I sent emails to like CCTV people being like, do you reckon you could just give us a stream and I could just detect birds from your CCTV streams, and you get decidedly no response, but for obvious like privacy implications, right? Like, but I think I certainly think that would be a really cool area to explore.
There is that Apple Finder network, right? We get these
Oh, yeah,
Apple pop
yeah,
things,
yeah.
and then you know, Find My Phone.
Yeah.
I think Find My Phone is some
Yeah,
people are happy. Some people happy to share.
Yeah.
I had a question, which was I guess like continuously at any time you could like add up the number of active sites, or they're giving you strips of time.
yeah,
And then you could splice that against satellite imaging
hmm
at the pixel level.
Yeah.
So you could like find the pixel that, you know, for this day
Yeah,
is giving
yeah.
me audio, and then do a kind of, you know,
Across sorts.
learn on both of these signals
Yeah.
jointly. And then you could do things like, you know, when you give me another bit of satellite imagery, I could then generate the
Yeah.
audio, or vice versa.
Yeah. So in Cape Town, where that Ames collaborator is, NASA did a series of super high quality hyperspectral flights over different areas of the Western Cape, and it's like enormous. And they put 300, no, oh no, it was more. It was maybe like there was like 500 sampling sites in the dry season and 500 in the wet season for acoustics, overlaying with these hyperspectral stripes. And I think that's exactly what they're trying to look at, is like, you know. And so I talked to those people and I was like, well, why don't you go for that keystone sound idea? But like for a certain certain hyperspectral profile, you only see these kind of sounds, or you only hear these kind of sounds. Yeah.
But wouldn't you just want to use more routine satellite data, so that you can do things like, you know, I mean, I guess the idea would be something along the lines of, whilst I might not necessarily know what a, you know, particular sort of small blob of a satellite image means, but if
Yeah.
I can learn what that means in its particular context, then I can use that as a kind of enhanced sensor of satellite degradation, because I've, you know, given it the context of a number of audio recordings as well. So it's a bit more like I want to use routine satellite data to spot ecosystem degradation, and I can do that by enhancing it by the fact that in a few cases I've got audio as well.
Yeah. I think there's with satellite data, there's kind of long been the discussion of like empty forest syndrome, where like a forest looks healthy from above, but within, you know, for other reasons, there's been cascades. So yeah.
So
that would be.
You think you couldn't do, because I guess if you're just using, if you imagine that most of the time you don't have acoustic information, then by implication you wouldn't really be able to pull very much from the satellite. But I guess in some sense you might pick up stuff by, you know, when you've got satellite imaging, you don't look just at a single location. You're looking across you can look over a wide area and over a length of time. So even though the information might not really be contained in like any one time, it could be contained over like 3 days of imaging and several 100 kilometers, and then the information is sort of distributed around that. Then it's got either a good ecosystem or a bad ecosystem.
No, I certainly think that'll be super interesting. There's people who've used satellite data to predict acoustic propagation, right? Because you got topology and you got canopy structure, so you can quite accurately predict just like sound dispersion.
That's a good technical one.
Yeah.
On the CNN embedding,
Mhm.
it's the 128 dimensional space. You said that's taken over 20-minute intervals. Was that?
Yeah, there's a major like weakness of that bit is it was done like so they're done on the 1 second resolution, and
1
then
second resolution. Okay.
yeah. So for the predictions of species occurrence, we keep it in the 1 second resolution.
Mhm.
But for the first one, we were looking at predictions of like time and habitat quality and stuff. I think we averaged at the 5 minute resolution.
I was going to say it's quite big, the input data.
Yeah.
Input feature space.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah, but I think you'd be a lot better. That's kind of what we're trying to go towards with those interpretable soundscape models is like, rather than just averaging, like find the most important short snippets of audio.
Why is it that the ecologists care about? Sorry.
That's
Why do they care about migrations? Is it just because they care about birds, or do like migrations tell you about climate change or some other like bigger thing?
So I think there's a number of reasons. One nice thing I've seen is like spring mismatch hypothesis. So birds which are in temperate regions breeding and then go to winter in tropical regions come back to the temperate regions based on the temperature at their tropical location. But climate change changes, we know, especially temperate dynamics and making spring come earlier and warmer earlier, right? So the birds who are coming from the tropics have evolved in theory to come at the right time, right? Just when the shoots are coming, or if they're flycatchers, they come a bit later in the spring. But as spring moves really fast, they can't adapt. And so the local resident species get all the resources, and it affects like the resource allocation too. So it's like testing hypotheses like this of like population declines linked to migratory dynamics, and also maybe knowing certain areas which are highly used by migrants as stopovers, like high value sites, versus like other areas which, if you're fragmenting a landscape, which you keep.